Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Casual Audio Papers. Today, I wanted just to begin. This is probably going to take a few days again, but I mentioned in the previous paper that we were doing this paper here in Perspectives on Psychology called 6 Lessons for a Cogent Science of Implicit Bias and Its Criticism, which, as of 2019, of course, it was probably a good, I guess, just a criticism regarding the science behind implicit bias. And it's important. I don't know within the last 3 years if these sort of questions have been answered, but we will get right into it. So, the abstract. Skepticism about the explanatory value of implicit bias in understanding social discrimination has grown considerably. The current article argues that both the dominant narrative about implicit bias as well as extant criticism are based on a selective focus on particular findings that fails to consider the broader literature on attitudes and implicit measures. To provide a basis to move forward, the current article discusses 6 lessons for a cogent science of implicit bias. A. There is no evidence that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their implicit biases. B. Conceptual correspondence is essential for interpretations of dissociations between implicit and explicit bias. C. There is no basis to expect strong, unconditional relations between implicit bias and behavior. D. Implicit bias is less, not more, stable over time than explicit bias. E. Context matters fundamentally for the outcomes obtained with implicit bias measures. And F. Implicit measurement scores do not provide process pure reflections of bias. The 6 lessons provide guidance for research that aims to provide more compelling evidence for the properties of implicit bias. At the same time, they suggest that extant criticism does not justify the conclusion that implicit bias is irrelevant for the understanding of social discrimination. Keywords: attitudes, consciousness, context, effects, implicit bias, measurement. Like many other high-profile phenomena in social psychology, research on implicit bias has become the target of increased scrutiny. Although critics have expressed concerns about the meaning and significance of the implicit bias construct for more than a decade, skeptical views have received significantly more attention over the past few years. In fact, the growing skepticism has become so pervasive that even early proponents have started to question the explanatory value of implicit bias, with some critics dismissing the construct as entirely irrelevant for the psychological understanding of social discrimination. Similar shifts can be found in the coverage of implicit bias research in popular media, although references to implicit bias in the public discourse about social discrimination are at an all-time high. Criticism of implicit bias research is receiving much more attention, which is reflected in critical headlines such as, "Can we really measure implicit bias? Maybe not," or "The False Science of Implicit Bias." In the current article, I argue that both the mainstream narrative about implicit bias, as well as extant criticism of implicit bias research, have failed to consider key insights in the broader literature on attitudes and implicit measures. Although these insights pose other unacknowledged challenges to the mainstream narrative about implicit bias, they suggest that at least some of the dominant criticism is based on a selective focus on particular findings that ignores key insights into the broader literature. At the same time, an expanded focus that includes the broader literature on attitudes and implicit measures suggests that the meaning of numerous findings is ambiguous and that, therefore, many dominant questions about implicit bias remain unanswered. To provide common ground and a basis to move forward, in the current article, I discuss 6 lessons for an empirically, theoretically, and methodologically informed science of implicit bias, and critical debates about the range and limits of the construct in understanding the psychological underpinnings of social discrimination. Together, the 6 lessons suggest that research on implicit bias would benefit from considering the broader literature on implicit measures as well as historical debates on research on attitudes. At the same time, they suggest that the criticisms raised against research on implicit bias do not justify the inference that the construct is entirely irrelevant for the psychological understanding of social discrimination. The main conclusion is that future research adhering to the normative implications of the 6 lessons is essential for a more nuanced understanding of implicit bias, its psychological characteristics, and its potential contribution to social discrimination. Lesson 1. There is no evidence that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their implicit biases. Discussion. The development of implicit measures can be traced back to 2 independent lines of research with distinct conceptual roots. On the one hand, the development of the evaluative priming task. This is actually, in the last episode, one of the ones that I participated in. The development of the evaluative priming task was based on the idea that attitudes, conceptualized as object evaluation associations in memory, can be activated automatically to the extent that the association between the attitude object and its stored summary evaluation is sufficiently strong. On the other hand, the development of the implicit association test was inspired by research on implicit memory, suggesting that past experiences can influence responses in the absence of explicit memory for the relevant experiences. Although the EPT and IAT are just two among more than a dozen implicit measures that are available to date, most research on implicit bias has relied on either one or the other conceptualization, whereas research guided by the conceptual roots of the EPT tends to emphasize the unintentionality, efficiency, and uncontrollability of attitude activation without any claims of unawareness. Research guided by the conceptual roots of the IAT emphasizes the idea that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. Claims of unawareness are often based on the methodological truism that implicit measures, in contrast to explicit measures, do not require that participants are aware of the to-be-measured mental contents. Whereas accurate self-reports on explicit measures presuppose that participants are aware of the to-be-measured mental contents, implicit measures do not require awareness because participants are not directly asked about them. Instead, mental contents are inferred from participants' performance, for instance, speed and/or accuracy, on experimental paradigms based on sequential priming or response interference. It is often assumed on the basis of this methodological difference that explicit measures capture conscious biases, whereas implicit measures capture unconscious biases. Because implicit measures do not require awareness of the to-be-measured mental contents, they certainly have the potential to capture unconscious mental contents that evade assessment via explicit measures. However, this possibility does not imply that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. Any such claim is an empirical hypothesis that has to be evaluated on the basis of relevant evidence. Indeed, a closer look at the available evidence raises serious doubts about the veracity of this hypothesis. A common argument in favor of the unawareness hypothesis is that correlations between implicit and explicit measures tend to be rather low. The theoretical idea underlying this argument is that unawareness of the mental contents captured by implicit measures makes it impossible to verbally report these contents on an explicit measure, which would lead to low correlations between implicit and explicit measures. Of course, correlations between the two kinds of measures can be expected to be low if people are unaware of the mental contents captured by implicit measures. However, correlations between implicit and explicit measures can be low for various other reasons that have nothing to do with lack of awareness. In the area of intergroup bias, for example, several studies have found that correlations between implicit and explicit measures are significantly higher among participants with low motivation to control prejudiced reactions compared with participants with high motivation to control prejudiced reactions. That makes sense? Although it might be possible to reconcile this finding with the unawareness hypothesis in a post hoc fashion, it is predicted a priori by extant theories suggesting that verbal reports of activated mental contents depend on the motivation and opportunity to control their expression. So basically, studies find that people who are actively trying to, let's say, compensate for their supposed implicit biases, the correlations are significantly higher among people that are not trying to compensate, which makes sense because you're consciously saying, well, I am not biased in this way and I will prove it. But then this is there's a post hoc hypothesis saying that, well, that's just of course what you're doing, so therefore the implicit bias is still there, it's just that you are aware of it, and so therefore the correlation is lower, and all of that sort of stuff. But what this does is create a hypothesis that is assumed a priori instead of being exegeted from the data, which is a problem. According to this view, correlations between implicit and explicit measures should be low when participants have both the motivation and opportunity to control the expression of activated mental contents. In contrast, correlations between the two kinds of measures should be high when participants lack either the motivation or opportunity to control the expression of activated mental contents. More direct evidence against the unawareness hypothesis comes from research by Hahn, Judd, Hirsch, and Blair, who investigated whether participants can predict their scores on implicit measures. In a series of studies, participants were asked to predict their scores on multiple IATs capturing attitudes toward different social groups, and then completed the same IATs. Counter to the widespread assumption that participants are unaware of the mental contents captured by the IAT, participants were able to predict the pattern of their IAT scores with a high degree of accuracy, meaning median correlations between predicted and actual patterns of IAT scores were around 0.65. Accuracy on the prediction of IAT scores was high regardless of participants' prior experience with the IAT, regardless of how much information participants received about the IAT, and regardless of whether the IAT was described as a measure of true beliefs or cultural associations. Moreover, predicted and actual IAT scores were highly correlated, although self-reported evaluations on explicit measures showed the same low correlations with IAT scores that are typically observed in this area. These findings pose a challenge to the hypothesis that people are unaware of the mental contents captured by implicit measures. The findings of Hahn et al. Also debunk another common argument in favor of the unawareness hypothesis. Many visitors of the Project Implicit website are quite surprised when they are informed about their IAT performance, suggesting that the feedback they receive on their level of implicit bias deviates from their prior assumptions about their personal level of implicit bias. Such surprise reactions have been interpreted as evidence for the unawareness hypothesis, in that people should not be surprised about their IAT feedback if they were aware of their personal level of implicit bias. However, surprise reactions can also occur when the metric used to convert participants' numeric IAT scores into verbal feedback, for instance, strong preference for whites compared to blacks, deviates from the participants' naive metric in labeling their personal level of implicit bias. The findings by Hahn et al. Are consistent with this argument, showing that although participants are highly accurate in predicting their patterns of IAT scores, their naive metric to label different levels of implicit bias stretches the metric used to convert numeric IAT scores into verbal feedback on the project implicit bias. So in other words, when you take the number and turn it into a statement, you agree much less about the statement and much more about the number. So it's more of an interpretive issue rather than a numerical issue. Because labeling conventions for what should be considered a weak, moderate, or strong bias are arbitrary in the sense that treating one metric as correct and the other one as incorrect has no objective basis, interpretations of surprise reactions as evidence for the unawareness hypothesis seem premature and empirically questionable. Figure 1. Average implicit association test scores predictions 1 through 7 scale, and average actual IAT scores. Shaded areas represent the areas in which implicit bias scores would be labeled as slightly more positive on the prediction scales, or as slight preference, according to conventions from the Project Implicit website. Figure adapted from Hahn, Judd, Hirsch, and Blair, reprinted with permission from the American Psychological Association. Although the current available evidence poses a challenge to the hypothesis that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures, people may still be unaware of either the origin or the effects of these mental contents, or both. For example, on the basis of a review of the available evidence, Gawronski et al. Concluded that people are sometimes unaware of the origin of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. However, the same is true for the mental contents underlying responses on explicit measures, in that people are often unable to identify the causes of their self-reported preferences. That is, people often know very well how much they like or dislike a given object, and they are perfectly able to report their subjective evaluations on a self-report measure, but they may not know why they like or dislike the object, as captured by the popular phrase, "I like it, but I don't know why." Thus, although people are sometimes unaware of the origin of the mental contents captured by implicit measures, lack of source awareness does not seem to be a feature that distinguishes mental contents captured by implicit measures from mental contents captured by explicit measures. A more promising candidate seems to be the impact of the mental contents captured by implicit measures. Gawronski et al. Concluded that a. the mental contents underlying implicit measures may influence judgments and behavior outside of awareness, and b. such unconscious influences may not occur for the mental contents captured by explicit measures. In line with this conclusion, I kind of spaced out for a second. The mental contents underlying implicit measures may influence judgments and behaviors outside of awareness, and such unconscious influences may not occur for the mental contents captured by explicit measures. Okay. In line with this conclusion, findings by Gawronski et al. Showed that participants interpreted ambiguous behavior by an out-group member more negatively than the same behavior by an in-group member, and the relative size of this effect was positively related to participants' implicit intergroup bias on an IAT. There was no relation between biased interpretations of ambiguous behavior and participants' explicit intergroup bias. Note that the obtained relation between implicit intergroup bias and biased interpretations of ambiguous behavior was unaffected by participants' motivation to control prejudiced reactions. That is, higher levels of implicit intergroup bias were associated with greater bias in the interpretation of ambiguous behavior, even when participants were highly motivated to control prejudiced reactions. Yet, motivation to control did moderate the relation between implicit and explicit intergroup bias, in that implicit and explicit bias were positively related only for participants with low motivation to control prejudiced reactions, but not for participants with high motivation to control prejudiced reactions. Drawing on extant theories of bias correction, Gawronski et al. Interpreted these findings as evidence for the hypothesis that the mental contents captured by implicit measures influence the processing of ambiguous information outside of awareness, leading to biased interpretations of ambiguous behavior even when people are motivated to control prejudiced reactions. Although the findings from Gawronski et al. Are consistent with this conclusion, the study suffers from a number of methodological limitations, one being that the type of bias measured, implicit versus explicit, was confounded with the specific contents of the two measures, evaluative responses to faces in the implicit measure versus agreement with statements about cultural differences and perceived group relations in the explicit measure. Thus, it is unclear whether the obtained results reflect a genuine difference between implicit and explicit bias, or b, a spurious difference that was driven by the different contents of the two bias measures. See Lesson 2 for a more detailed discussion of this issue. These ambiguities undermine the possibility of drawing strong conclusions from the findings of Gawronski et al. Moreover, although lack of impact awareness seems consistent with a broad range of findings in the implicit bias literature, for instance, observed relations between implicit bias scores and measures of seating distance and nonverbal behavior, no other studies have directly tested this hypothesis with appropriate designs and awareness measures. Thus, despite common claims regarding lack of impact awareness, compelling evidence for these claims is surprisingly scarce. So people are basically drawing far too many conclusions on far too sparse evidence, at least when it came to 2019. Implications. Lesson 1 suggests that statements about unawareness should be treated as hypotheses that require empirical evidence. Moreover, because implicit biases have multiple aspects that could be outside of awareness, it is essential to clearly specify which aspect is assumed to be outside of awareness. Do claims about unawareness refer to a, the mental contents underlying responses on implicit bias measures, content awareness, or b, the origin of the underlying mental contents, source awareness, or c, effects of the underlying mental contents on judgment and behavior, impact awareness. And that's really important because I think typically when people talk about implicit bias, they sort of do like a little bait and switch. They may talk about B, the origin or the source, the awareness of the source of the bias, and like demonstrate that that is true, and then say, therefore, you're also unaware of the contents, and therefore you're also unaware of the impact. Or maybe you're unaware of the contents, and therefore you're unaware of the impact. But it's really important to determine which one is actually grounded in the science, if any of them, or if all of them, and to determine to what degree each one actually is demonstrated by the science. I think most popular books like, I don't know, Biased or How to Argue with a Racist or White Fragility or something, they sort of just draw a line from the science to the impact awareness and the actual impacts, and they don't really take very good care of the actual science on the issue. Because some aspects of unawareness may be common for both implicit and explicit bias, like lack of source awareness, researchers should also specify whether unawareness of a particular aspect is assumed to be a unique feature of implicit bias that distinguishes it from explicit bias, and provide empirical evidence for these hypotheses. If it is not possible to provide such evidence, it would seem appropriate to refrain from making strong claims about unawareness, or to explicitly describe such claims as speculative. In fact, counter to a widespread assumption in the literature, there is currently no evidence that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. If anything, the available evidence suggests that people are aware of the mental contents underlying implicit measures, which allows them to predict their implicit bias scores with a high degree of accuracy. I want to amend a statement. The book Biased, I forgot who it's by, but I haven't read very much of it, and I don't think I would number that one in the popular books that don't deal seriously with the science, although they do have a particular agenda they're pushing. The science seems to be legitimate from what I could tell in the little that I have read from the book. So just wanted to make that amendment. Of course, it is possible that future research will pose a challenge to this conclusion by A. providing the kind of evidence for the content unawareness hypothesis that is currently lacking, B. questioning the reliability of previous evidence against the content unawareness hypothesis, or C. providing new evidence that reconciles previous findings with the content unawareness hypothesis. However, in the absence of such evidence, it would seem appropriate to refrain from making empirically unsubstantiated claims about lack of content awareness in the interpretation of empirical findings. The same conclusion applies to claims about lack of source awareness and lack of impact awareness, which should be tested with appropriate designs and reliable measures of awareness. At this point, the available evidence suggests that people can be unaware of the origin of their implicit biases, but the same is true of explicit biases. Moreover, the preliminary evidence that implicit but not explicit biases influence judgments and behavior outside of awareness is rather weak and prone to alternative interpretations. Lesson 2. Conceptual correspondence is essential for the interpretations of dissociations between implicit and explicit bias. Discussion. Essential issue discussed under Lesson 1 is that correlations between implicit and explicit measures can be low for various reasons that have nothing to do with lack of awareness. For a review, see Hoffman, Geschwinder et al., including high motivation and opportunity to control the expression of activated mental contents. Yet even when these psychological factors are taken into account, correlations between implicit and explicit measures can be low for simple methodological reasons. In line with the correspondence principle in research on attitude-behavior relations, correlations between implicit and explicit measures tend to be higher when the two measures correspond in terms of their dimensionality and content. In other words, as long as you're measuring one particular type of implicit versus explicit bias, you will tend to get higher correlations, as opposed to if you're measuring one type in implicit and another type in explicit, then of course you get lower levels of correlation. And that's one of the issues that they're bringing up, is in much of the methodology, they don't really create that sort of distinction appropriately. However, correlations tend to be rather low when there is little or no conceptual correspondence. For example, A meta-analysis by Hoffman, Gawronski et al. Found that implicit measures capturing relative preferences for one group over another show higher correlations to explicit measures of the same relative preference compared with non-relative evaluations of one of the two groups. Likewise, implicit measures of racial bias using black and white faces as stimuli tend to show higher correlations to explicit measures assessing judgments of the same faces compared with judgments of anti-discrimination policies and perceptions of racial discrimination. So in other words, you might implicitly have a bias in favor of white faces, and then you might say, you might evaluate the faces and end up evaluating white faces as more beautiful explicitly, but that might have a low correlation with whether or not you agree with anti-discrimination policies and that sort of thing, or your perception of racial discrimination. In general, correlations between implicit and explicit measures increase as a function of increasing correspondence between the two measures, and they decrease with decreasing correspondence. See Lesson 3 for a discussion of similar issues in research on the prediction of behavior. Although the correspondence principle is uncontroversial among attitude researchers, its significance has been largely ignored in the literature on implicit bias. To the extent that measures of implicit and explicit bias do not correspond in terms of their target object, the type of measure would be confounded with the target object, rendering dissociations between the two measures ambiguous. To illustrate this problem, imagine a study in which white participants completed the modern racism scale and an EPT using black and white faces as primes. Imagine further that the implicit measure predicted spontaneous nonverbal reactions in an interracial interaction, and the explicit measure predicted deliberate verbal behavior in the same interaction. According to extant theories, such a finding may be interpreted as evidence for the hypothesis that implicit measures should predict spontaneous but not deliberate behavior, whereas explicit measures should predict deliberate but not spontaneous behavior. I like how it's like saying, for example, let's do this, and then it gives a bunch of references for people who did exactly this. However, in a strict sense, the finding could also be driven by the different contents of the two measures. That is, evaluations of faces might be more strongly related to spontaneous, nonverbal behavior in interracial interactions, regardless of whether evaluations of faces are assessed with an implicit or an explicit measure. For instance, an explicit measure asking participants to rate the faces presented in the EPT. Conversely, responses to the social issues covered by the items of the MRS, the modern racism scale, for instance, perception of discrimination, evaluations of anti-discrimination policies, might be more strongly related to deliberate verbal behavior in interracial interactions, regardless of whether responses to these issues are captured with the MRS or a corresponding implicit measure. Similar considerations apply to research on the incremental validity of implicit measures, which suggests that implicit measures often explain the unique variance of a given outcome measure over and above explicit measures, to the extent that the type of measure is confounded with different target objects. Such findings may speak to the incremental validity of measures assessing different contents, which may be independent of whether these measures are implicit or explicit. The same concerns apply to studies on the determinants of implicit and explicit bias. For example, writing a counterattitudinal essay in support of anti-discrimination policies may reduce racial bias on the MRS without affecting racial bias on the IAT. However, in contrast to the conclusion that cognitive dissonance changes explicit but not implicit bias, the obtained dissociation may also be due to the different contents of the two measures. That is, writing a counterattitudinal essay in support of anti-discrimination policies may change attitudes towards anti-discrimination policies, regardless of whether these attitudes are assessed with an explicit or implicit measures. Conversely, writing a counter-attitudinal essay in support of anti-discrimination policies may leave evaluations of black and white faces unaffected, regardless of whether these evaluations are assessed with an implicit or explicit measure. Meaning, again, you may agree with anti-discrimination policies, but still prefer white faces when you are judging beauty, for instance. An important aspect in this context is the difference between responses to categories and responses to exemplars of a given category. A common practice in research on implicit and explicit bias is the use of images of exemplars, for instance, black and white faces as primes in the EPT, as stimuli in the implicit measure, and to assess evaluations of the relevant categories in the explicit measure. For instance, feeling thermometer or semantic differential ratings of the categories black people and white people. Although it seems reasonable to assume that a person's responses to the exemplars of a given category are related to that person's responses to the category in general, evaluations of exemplars and categories are conceptually distinct constructs. Thus, studies using exemplars as target objects in implicit measures and categories as target objects in explicit measures include a confound between the type of measure and target object, rendering any dissociations between the two measures ambiguous. So, for instance, someone gives you a face of a, Selena Gomez, and you might say, yeah, she's very pretty, but that doesn't mean you find white people pretty. Or Rihanna, and you might say she's very pretty, but that doesn't mean that you find black people pretty, for instance. So there's a dissociation oftentimes between the exemplar they use in these implicit association tests and the category that they're trying to draw an inference about. The non-trivial implications of this confound can be illustrated with a reanalysis of data by Gawronski, Peters, Broku, and Strack, study 3 of their 2008 study. The study included an affect misattribution procedure using black and white faces as primes, a feeling thermometer assessing evaluations of the categories black people and white people, and likability ratings of the black and white faces used as primes in the AMP. AMP scores of racial bias showed a significant positive correlation with racial bias in the likability ratings of the faces. R equals 0.45, P was less than 0.001. But AMP scores were unrelated to racial bias in feeling thermometer ratings of the category. R was equal to negative 0.09 and P was equal to 0.4. Note that racial bias in the likability ratings of the faces was also unrelated to bias in feeling thermometer ratings of the categories. R was equal to 0.07 and P was equal to 0.51. Together, these results suggest that, in contrast to the idea that dissociations between AMP scores of racial bias and feeling thermometer preferences reflect genuine differences between implicit and explicit bias, such dissociations are, at least partly, rooted in the difference between responses to exemplars versus categories. Some readers might wonder about the implications of these differences for research using the IAT, which seems to be sensitive to both the specific exemplars presented in the task and the particular categories applied to a given exemplar. A reanalysis of data by Gawronski, Morrison, Phillis, and Galdi, study 2 of their 2017 study, supports the idea that IAT scores reflect responses to both exemplars and categories. In this study, IAT scores of racial bias showed significant positive correlations with likability ratings of the faces used in the IAT. R was equal to 0.37 and P was lesser than 0.001, and with feeling thermometer ratings of the categories, R equal to 0.38 and P is less than 0.001, Moreover, the relation to either measure remained statistically significant after controlling for the respective other in that IAT scores were still positively related to likability ratings of the faces after controlling for feeling thermometer ratings of the category. R was equal to 0.17 and P was equal to 0.032. And the feeling thermometer ratings of the categories after controlling for likability ratings of the faces. R was equal to 0.2 and P was equal to 0.011. These findings suggest that any finding with the IAT, for instance, experimental effect on IAT scores, correlation between IAT scores and another measure, could be driven by either exemplar or category responses. This ambiguity makes it necessary to include explicit measures of both exemplar and category responses to avoid incorrect interpretations of potential dissociations in terms of features of the measures, meaning implicit versus explicit, rather than target objects, meaning exemplars versus categories. Although the distinction between responses to categories and responses to exemplars raises important questions about the processes underlying their relation, for instance, role of inductive inferences in bottom-up effects of exemplar responses on category responses, role of deductive inferences in top-down effects of category responses on exemplar responses. See Ledgerwood et al. 2018. It is just one example of how confounds between type of measure and measured contents lead to ambiguities in the interpretation of empirical findings. Another example is the difference between evaluations of objects and behavior, different from the emphasis on evaluations of behaviors in traditional theories of attitude-behavior relations. Most implicit measures capture evaluations of objects rather than evaluations of behaviors toward those objects. Thus, to the extent that implicit measures are designed to capture evaluations of objects, meaning for instance evaluations of a Muslim political candidate, and explicit measures are designed to capture evaluations of behaviors towards these objects, for instance evaluations of supporting a Muslim political candidate, the type of measure, implicit or explicit, would be confounded with different contents, objects versus behaviors, rendering dissociations between the two measures ambiguous. Implications. Lesson 2 suggests that conceptual correspondence is essential for understanding the unique psychological properties of implicit and explicit bias. To the extent that an implicit measure has little or no conceptual correspondence with an explicit measure, their relation can be expected to be low for simple methodological reasons. In such cases, it would be premature to interpret their weak relation as evidence for the hypothesis that implicit and explicit measures capture distinct constructs. Likewise, if the type of measure is confounded with different contents, any finding suggesting distinct antecedents or distinct predictive relations remains ambiguous because the obtained dissociation could be due to either A, the implicit versus explicit nature of the measures, or B, the different contents of the two measures. Given the large proportion of studies that confounded the type of measure with different contents, a sobering conclusion is that, despite more than 20 years of research, many important questions about the properties of implicit versus explicit bias still require future research to provide unambiguous answers. At this point, it is entirely possible that several findings suggesting unique psychological properties of implicit versus explicit bias turn out to be independent of the distinction between implicit and explicit measures, and instead reflect differences in terms of the measured contents. For instance, responses to categories versus responses to exemplars. Thus, to provide more compelling evidence for genuine differences between implicit and explicit bias, it is essential to use measures that correspond in terms of the measured contents, To the extent that previously obtained dissociations between implicit and explicit bias disappear when their respective contents are held constant, claims about functional differences between implicit and explicit bias would be empirically unfounded. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there for now for at least this episode. 3 things. Well, let me just rename these lessons. Lesson 1, there's no evidence that people are unaware of the mental contents underlying their implicit biases. And Lesson 2, conceptual correspondence is essential for interpretations of dissociations between implicit and explicit bias. And let's see, something I learned from Lesson 1. Well, it's really something that I've read this paper before, and so, what I did learn is, though, let's see, what did I learn that's new? It's really about awareness. Implicit versus explicit measures, or the concept of implicit versus explicit, at least in the hypothesis that's typically pushed around, is implicit bias is one that is a bias that you're unaware of. And it's really important to understand that there's actually no real evidence that suggests that people are unaware of their of the mental contents of their implicit of their biases, both explicit and implicit. And so you have 3 options there. Are you talking about the source, or the contents, or the behavior that follows? So are you unaware of the source, which there seems to be evidence that you are unaware of the sources of your biases, but that includes explicit as well as implicit. So that doesn't actually provide evidence for implicit bias per se, just that if you are biased against something or someone, you are not really sure why, oftentimes. But the contents, there's no evidence that people are actually unaware of the contents of their biases, both implicit and explicit, which seems to, and there's evidence against that idea, which seems to undermine the idea of implicit bias. So, okay, well then what are you unaware of? If the idea of implicit bias is that you're unaware of your biases, then that seems to undermine the idea of implicit bias. And so in order for implicit bias to really, stand, you have to come up with either a different hypothesis, or you have to do more research and discover that people actually are unaware to some degree of the contents of their biases. And then the third thing, of course, is the impact. Maybe you're unaware of the impact that your biases actually have, but again, there's no real evidence that is the case. Typically, the evidence that's brought up is like broad statistical anomalies regarding hiring or regarding healthcare or whatever, but that's not really studying the impact of implicit bias, because you don't really, like, how many of those people actually took the test, the implicit association test, and then actually were provided the resumes, the mock resumes that they were going to hire people based off of. The studies aren't there. It's more just a spurious correlation that's drawn more a priori because we're wanting to find that correlation as opposed to finding it from the data. And then a lesson from, or what I learned from lesson 2 is I think one of the biggest things is the exemplar versus the category. Oftentimes you might have a particular opinion about the exemplar. Like, for instance, let's say the white or black person has RBF. Okay, but does that mean, and so therefore you don't like that particular exemplar? But can you create a general conclusion based on those results? Well, we don't know exactly. And that's the issue, is we don't know. And so more study is required in order to create more correspondence between the concepts, to create more conceptual correspondence. Because as it stands, there's too much dissociation between the concepts that have been studied, and therefore the conclusions drawn are largely unfounded. Well, if you have any questions about implicit bias, or you want to read this article on your own and come to your own conclusions, or argue, or bring up a more recent study that actually answers these questions, that would all be very well appreciated. So, yeah, have a good day.